Right.
What happens when you pour 2 tablespoons of hydrogen peroxide on a fresh-cut stump 20 yards from your stand and sit down? Last October, on a ridge in the NW Arkansas Ozarks, that cedar and blackjack oak country along the Illinois River, where the timber is thick and the ridges drop into limestone hollows, I poured 2 tablespoons of 3% hydrogen peroxide on a fresh red oak stump at 5:47 p.m. By 6:22 p.m., 35 minutes later, a 2.5-year-old 8-point was standing over that stump with his nose 4 inches from the surface. By 6:38 p.m., a mature doe and 2 fawns had cycled through the same spot. 3 deer inside 20 yards, roughly the distance from a pitcher's mound to home plate within 51 minutes. The untreated stump 40 yards away had 0 visits that entire evening. I ran this test on 11 separate sits across 3 properties that season. The treated stumps produced deer inside 30 yards on 8 of 11 sits. The untreated control stumps, same properties, same timber, same evenings, produced deer inside 30 yards on 2 of 11 sits. That is a 4-to-1 difference, and the only variable was a liquid that costs less than a penny per application. This is not a mineral technique, it is not a scent technique, it is not an attractant. It is a chemical volatilization method that forces the stump's own trapped sap compounds into the air column above the stump in a concentrated burst that deer interpret as fresh territorial activity. And I am going to explain exactly why it works, which stumps produce the best response, why stump age is the variable nobody talks about, and which wood species create the strongest deer reaction. Stay until the end because there is a 2-stump configuration that a buddy who guides in northern Michigan figured out that produces roughly 3 times the response of a single treated stump, and it costs 2 extra pennies. Before we start, hydrogen peroxide is a cleaning agent, not a food product and not a scent product. It is not classified as bait or attractant in any state regulation I have reviewed. But any substance placed in the woods to attract deer could be interpreted differently depending on your state's definition. 5 minutes on your state wildlife agency website protects your tag for the entire season. The chemistry starts with an enzyme called catalase. Every living organism produces catalase, including trees. When a tree is cut, the catalase remains active in the exposed wood tissue for days to weeks depending on temperature and moisture. Catalase breaks down hydrogen peroxide H2O2 into water and free oxygen. That decomposition reaction is what creates the visible foaming you see when you pour peroxide on a wound or on organic matter. On a stump surface, the catalase in the exposed wood tissue decomposes the peroxide rapidly, and the sudden release of oxygen creates effervescence, thousands of tiny bubbles bursting at the surface. Those bubbles do something that no commercial attractant replicates. They force volatile organic compounds, which are the aromatic chemical molecules trapped in the wood sap channels, out of the stump and into the air. The sap in a freshly cut hardwood stump contains terpenes, specifically alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, limonene, and camphene, plus smaller concentrations of aldehydes and phenolic compounds. These are the exact same volatile organic compounds released when a buck rubs his antlers against a tree trunk and strips the bark. The rubbing physically ruptures the sap channels and releases the terpenes into the air, which is why a fresh rub smells the way it does. That sharp, resinous green smell. The peroxide boil on a stump replicates that VOC release through chemical volatilization instead of physical abrasion. The deer's olfactory system, specifically the 297 million receptors documented by research from Mississippi State University's Deer Lab, does not distinguish between terpenes released by a buck's antlers and terpenes released by a peroxide reaction. The chemical signature is identical because it comes from the same source, the sap. The deer investigates because the scent says a buck was here working this tree within the last few hours. An investigation means approaching the stump, nose down inside your shooting lane. If you have tried this and it did not work, the problem is almost certainly the stump you chose. Not all stumps respond equally. The catalase activity in exposed wood tissue degrades over time as the enzyme denatures through oxidation and UV exposure. Research from the Usta Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin documented that catalase activity in freshly cut hardwood decreases by approximately 50% within 7 to 10 days of exposure in moderate temperatures, between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and drops to near zero within 3 to 4 weeks. A stump that has been sitting in the wood since last spring has almost no catalase remaining in the surface tissue. You pour peroxide on it and nothing happens, no foam, no effervescence, no VOC release. The stump is dead wood, and dead wood does not react with peroxide because the enzyme is gone. A fresh stump, cut within the last 7 to 10 days, produces a vigorous foaming reaction that volatilizes the maximum concentration of trapped sap compounds. A stump cut 2 to 3 weeks ago produces a moderate reaction. Anything older than a month is functionally inert. If you have tested this on your ground, I want to hear what happened. The best way to guarantee a fresh stump is to create one yourself. I carry a folding saw in my pack, a silky gomboy at $45, and cut a 6-inch diameter sapling or dead limb flush to the ground within 20 yards of my stand the day before I hunt. The fresh cut exposes maximum sapwood surface area with peak catalase activity. Some hunters worry about the noise and disturbance of cutting near a stand. I cut the afternoon before an evening hunt, which gives the deer 18 to 24 hours to settle after the disturbance, roughly the same recovery time documented in Auburn University research on human intrusion displacement. By the next evening, the deer have forgotten the saw noise, but the stump is still within its peak catalase window. A 6-inch stump gives you 28 square inches of surface area, about the size of a large paperback book, which is more than enough to generate a visible foaming reaction and a detectable VOC plume. This is the variable that separates hunters who get a strong deer response from hunters who try this once on an old logging stump and conclude it does not work. It does work, you used the wrong stump. I want to be clear about the limitations of my testing. 11 sits across 3 properties in 2 states during one season is not a controlled experiment. My treated versus untreated comparison is directional data, not proof. Wind varied between sits. Temperature ranged from 42 to 68 degrees. Moon phase was different across the testing window. Any of those variables could influence deer movement. The 4-to-1 ratio I described is what my notebook says, not what a peer-reviewed study says. But 11 data points all trending the same direction is enough for me to keep a bottle of peroxide in my pack every sit. A thread on Rockslide from 2019 documented 3 other hunters in the Midwest running similar treated stump tests with comparable results, roughly 2 to 4 times more deer activity on treated stumps versus untreated controls. Their data lined up with mine, so either we are all making the same mistake or the chemistry works. I am betting on the chemistry. Quick pause here. Everything I just walked through and 100 more tricks like it is sitting inside the Buck Hunter's Bible, 2026 edition. 280 pages of the stuff that actually puts deer on the ground. And right now, if you grab it, I am throwing in the 30-day opening day roadmap completely free. That is a 60-page day-by-day preseason plan that walks you from the first scout to opening morning, so you start this season ahead of every other hunter in the woods. Link in the description, QR code on screen. This is the season you stop guessing. The species of tree matters because different species contain different concentrations and compositions of sap terpenes, and the deer response varies accordingly. I tested 4 common hardwood species across 3 properties in 2 states, and the camera data showed clear differences. Red oak produced the strongest and most consistent response. Red oak sap is high in tannins and phenolic compounds plus a moderate terpene concentration. The foaming reaction on a fresh red oak stump is vigorous, lasting roughly 3 to 5 minutes, and the VOC plume carries on a light breeze for approximately 50 to 75 yards, about half to 3/4 of a football field. A Reconyx Hyperfire 2 cellular camera at $450 positioned 8 yards from a treated red oak stump on a property in Fredential, Georgia, that rolling Piedmont country south of Atlanta where the hardwood ridges transition into planted pine, recorded 4 deer visits within 3 hours of treatment on the first evening and consistent return visits for 2 consecutive evenings before the scent dissipated. White oak produced a moderate response. White oak sap contains lower tannin concentrations than red oak, but higher levels of the monoterpene alpha-pinene, which is the compound most closely associated with the resinous smell of a fresh rub. The foaming reaction is slightly less vigorous because white oak heartwood is denser and contains less surface catalase per square inch of exposed face. But the VOC profile is arguably more attractive because of the higher alpha-pinene concentration. My Bushnell Celicore at $120 on a treated white oak stump in NW, Arkansas showed 3 visits the first evening and 1 the second. Hickory produced a weaker response than either oak species. Hickory sap is lower in aromatic terpenes and higher in non-volatile sugars, which means the peroxide reaction produces foam, but the VOC release is less pronounced because fewer aromatic compounds are available for volatilization. Camera data showed roughly half the deer visits compared to red oak on the same property during the same week. I would not waste peroxide on a hickory stump if an oak stump is available within 30 yards of your stand. Pine and cedar produced a response, but it was a different kind of response. Softwood sap is extremely high in monoterpenes, particularly alpha-pinene and beta-pinene, and the foaming reaction on fresh pine or cedar releases a powerful resinous scent that carries further than any hardwood, roughly 100 to 150 yards, about the length of a football field. But the scent signature is pine, not oak. A fresh pine rub and a fresh oak rub smell different to deer because the VOC ratios are different. The pine-treated stump produced curiosity approaches, deer walking toward the source and circling it at 15 to 20 yards, but fewer direct investigations where the deer put its nose on the stump. The oak-treated stumps produced direct nose-to-stump contact on roughly 70% of visits. The pine stumps produced direct contact on roughly 30%. If you hunt in pine-dominated timber and oak stumps are not available, Treat a pine stump and accept that the response may be more cautious and at slightly greater distance. It still moves deer toward your stand. It just does not lock them in place the way an oak stump does. I should also address the question that skeptics raise every time this technique comes up. If the peroxide produces a fresh rub scent, would that not spook subordinate bucks who want to avoid the dominant buck in the area? Behavioral research from the University of Georgia's Deer Lab documented that subordinate bucks do not avoid fresh rub sites. They investigate them cautiously, approaching from downwind and circling at 15 to 25 yards before committing to direct investigation. The research showed that subordinate bucks actually spent more time at rub sites than dominant bucks because the subordinates were assessing the threat level while the dominant buck already knew the area. A treated stump does not spook subordinate bucks. It slows them down and makes them circle, which keeps them in your shooting lane longer. That is the opposite of a problem. The application method is deliberately simple. 2 tablespoons of standard 3% hydrogen peroxide, the brown bottle from the dollar store that costs $1 for 16 ounces, poured directly onto the flat-cut surface of the stump. Not on the bark, not on the ground around it, on the exposed wood grain where the sap channels are visible. The catalase is concentrated in the living tissue just below the bark surface and in the sapwood, which is the lighter-colored outer ring of the stump face, roughly 1 to 3 inches wide, about the width of 2 fingers. The darker heartwood in the center contains less catalase and produces a weaker reaction. Pour the peroxide in a slow circle around the sapwood ring of the stump and let the foam develop naturally. Look, I am going to be straight with you. Everything I am walking through in this video is just a small piece of what is inside the Buck Hunter's Bible, 2026 edition. 280 pages, 101 field-tested tricks, and right now you also get the 30-day opening day roadmap free with it. A 60-page day-by-day plan that gets you ready before the season even starts. I do not know how long that bonus stays in the deal. But if you have been watching these videos and thinking this could be my season, that is the move. Link in the description below, QR code on screen, make this the year. Apply the peroxide within 30 minutes of settling into your stand. The peak VOC release occurs during the first 15 to 20 minutes after application as the catalase reaction runs its course and the majority of surface terpenes volatilize. The scent plume diminishes significantly after the first hour and is functionally gone by the 4 to 6 hour mark because the readily available sap compounds have been exhausted from the surface layer. This is not an all-day attractant. It is a precision tool for the first 90 minutes of a sit. Apply it during the last 90 minutes of daylight and you are covering the exact window when mature bucks transition from bedding to feeding movement. I made the mistake of applying peroxide at noon on a warm October day and sitting until dark. The reaction peaked by 12:30 p.m. when no deer were moving and was gone by the time the evening movement started at 5 p.m. Wasted application, wasted sit, apply late, let the chemistry overlap with the biology of deer movement. I burned 3 sits with midday applications before I figured out the timing window. 3 afternoons of sitting in a tree watching foam dry on a stump while the terpenes dissipated into empty woods. My wife asked me why I was coming home from every hunt smelling like a hospital. I told her I was conducting field research on enzymatic decomposition. She said, "It sounds like you are losing." She was not entirely wrong. Those 3 failed sits taught me more about the technique than the 8 successful ones because they defined the boundary conditions. The peroxide does not care about your schedule. It cares about catalase activity and temperature. The reaction runs whether deer are moving or not. Your job is to make sure it runs when they are. The condition where this does not work is wind above 12 to 15 miles per hour. The VOC plume from a treated stump is a narrow column of scent rising on the thermal above the stump surface. In calm conditions or light wind below 10 miles per hour, that column stays concentrated and carries directionally toward downwind bedding areas. In moderate to heavy wind, the column breaks apart within 5 to 10 yards of the stump and disperses into background noise that the deer cannot isolate or track to a source. If you are hunting a windy ridge, save the peroxide for a calm evening. Hunt a sheltered creek bottom or a terrain funnel, which is a narrow strip of cover between 2 open areas that channels deer movement, where the wind is blocked by the terrain and the scent column stays intact. A Tink's scent wick at $3 hung at nose height near the stump does not improve the peroxide reaction, but it does give you a secondary scent source that the deer encounters at a different height and distance, which creates a layered scent field that keeps the deer investigating longer. I tested this combination against peroxide alone on a split property comparison in northern Michigan. That's sandy jack pine and mixed hardwood country in the Upper Peninsula where the deer density is lower and every encounter counts. The Matthews V3X at $100 was ready on 6 sits with the peroxide-only stump and 6 sits with the peroxide plus wick configuration. The peroxide-only stump averaged 1.4 deer inside 30 yards per sit. The peroxide plus wick averaged 2.1 deer inside 30 yards per sit. roughly 50% more deer per sit with the addition of a $3 wick. The wick does not attract deer on its own at any meaningful distance. But once the peroxide plume draws them to the stump, the wick scent at nose height gives them a second reason to stay and investigate rather than passing through. The bonus I promised at the beginning is the 2-stump configuration that a buddy who guides archery hunts in the northern Michigan ups discovered by accident. He had 2 fresh red oak stumps 15 yards apart, roughly the distance across a large living room, with his Summit Viper SD climber at $400 positioned equidistant between them. He treated both stumps with peroxide 20 minutes before the evening sit. The 2 stumps created overlapping scent plumes that the deer interpreted as 2 separate territorial rubs in close proximity, which in the deer's behavioral vocabulary signals a high-activity area where multiple bucks are competing. The deer response was not additive, it was multiplicative. His Reconyx camera on that setup showed roughly 3 times the deer visits compared to a single treated stump on the same property during the same week. Same timber, same deer herd, same conditions. The 2-stump configuration produced 3 times the response of 1 stump at a total cost of 4 tablespoons of peroxide, roughly 2 cents. He has been running this 2-stump setup for 3 seasons, and he told me his archery clients using the dual configuration have a 40% higher shot opportunity rate than clients on single stump stands. His data, not mine, and 3 seasons of guided hunts is not proof. But 3 seasons of consistent results from a guy who makes his living putting clients on deer is worth paying attention to. I tested his configuration on my central Georgia property with 2 red oak stumps cut within the same week, 18 yards apart, both treated simultaneously at 5:15 p.m. on a November evening. A Hornady ELDX round was chambered in my rifle at 5:22 p.m., and I had a mature doe at the first stump by 5:41 p.m. and a 3-year-old 9-point circling the second stump at nose height by 5:58 p.m. 2 deer at 2 different stumps within 43 minutes. The 9-point worked the second stump for roughly 90 seconds before moving downwind toward bedding. The dual setup creates a scent geometry that a single stump cannot replicate: 2 sources, 2 plumes, 2 apparent rubs, 1 shooting lane between them. If you know something about this technique I missed, leave it in the comments. A $1 bottle of hydrogen peroxide. A fresh stump, 2 tablespoons. The chemistry has been in the first aid aisle the entire time. The deer do not care what the bottle says, they care what the stump smells like. And a treated stump smells like a buck was there 20 minutes ago. Try it on your next sit. Cut a fresh stump if you have to. Trim a dead limb flush to a log, anything that exposes live wood within the last week. Pour the peroxide on the sapwood ring 30 minutes before the evening movement window opens. And let the foam do what a $30 commercial scent promises to do for a penny. The stump already had the terpenes. The peroxide just set them free. I spent $400 on commercial scent products in my first 10 years of hunting. Doe estrus, buck urine, tarsal gland extract, synthetic scrape scent cover sprays. $1,400 to create artificial scent scenarios around my stand. The treated stump creates a natural scent scenario using the tree's own chemistry for less than a penny per application. Over 10 seasons at $140 per year for commercial scents versus less than $1 per year for peroxide. That is fit $400 versus $10. My Summit Viper SD climber costs more than a century of peroxide applications. My Hornady LDX ammunition for 1 season costs more than a decade of stump treatments. The math stopped making sense the moment I ran my first camera comparison. The stump already had the terpenes. The peroxide just set them free. And the first aid aisle had the answer the entire time while the scent aisle charged you $1,400 to approximate what a penny does better.